Another feature, of course, now, and this is really true of just the last several years, is that when it comes to the sexual brokenness that we see in culture, it's one thing when it's portrayed on movies and television. It's another thing when it's accessible more and more easily, and all of those things are true. But of course, now, with a disordered and unregulated view of sexuality, is being kind of hoisted on hearts and minds through what we might call institutional enforcement. It's one thing when sexual brokenness affects individuals. It's another when compliance to this new way of thinking about sex and sexuality, of thinking about the human body, of thinking about men and women, are actually enforced through the institutions like schools and the state. And certainly when it comes to media and culture, and increasingly even businesses that are expected to be mouthpieces of this confusion. And so that means every commercial, every television show, every ad has to feature at least some form of this sexual brokenness, whether it's in our thinking about who we are as individuals or the act itself. One other thing that's complicated this, and especially I think takes root in institutions, is what we might call the critical theory mood. I don't want to go back and really hash out all the ins and outs of what really is an academic theory, critical theory. But what critical theory is about dividing people up into groups based on chosen identities, and then giving those different groups moral status ahead of time, not based on what they do, but based on who they belong to. And so if you're part of this group that's separated by, say gender or immigration status or socioeconomic status or race or sexual orientation or gender identity, then that's the most important thing about you. And that either gives you a moral priority or it gives you moral guilt ahead of time. Now, most people haven't read the academic sources of critical theory, and I'm not recommending that you do. But we do have a culture now that does see people as primarily belonging to groups. And now that those groups involve sexual orientation and gender identity, where we group people together based on how they behave sexually with other people or how they see themselves, and that becomes the most important thing about them, and that they are then given moral superiority. And anyone who disagrees, anyone who doesn't think that those categories are actually identity categories, they're the ones considered not only wrong or mistaken, but actually increasingly evil and their views dangerous. That's a level of pressure that our kids face. Several weeks ago, I talked to a friend who has a close colleague who's a teacher at a junior high school in the Northeast. And she asked her friend, how many of the students in your class identify as LGBT or Q? In other words, they identify as one of those sexual minorities. And the teacher's response to her was as if she should have known the answer to her own question. Oh, all of them do. And she said, what do you mean all of them do? Are they sexually active? She said, oh, no, they're junior high. They're not, they're still nervous to talk to each other and that sort of thing. No, that's not it at all. I said, well, how can they identify as LGBTQ if they're not even behaving in any of these ways? And her friend's response to her was fascinating. She said, oh, because no one wants to be straight anymore. In other words, this mood now has infected the culture, including the culture of our kids, where to belong to certain groups is to be morally better, and to belong to other groups is to be morally worse. And no one wants to be cis. No one wants to be straight anymore. Now, increasingly, that critical theory mood is playing its way into institutions like schools and even legal realities. So right now, there's going to be an increasing battle. And you need to know this as a parent, that there is an increasing tension that's being created and that's being exploited between what may be called parental rights, those who should know what's best for their kids, who don't want their kids exposed to certain things, and what are now being called kids' rights. Now, they're not really kids' rights, because what kids have a right to is to be kept safe in their mind, to be kept safe in their body, to be kept safe in their heart, to be kept safe from mutilation and harm, that they have a right to those who love them the most. And of course, that's the parent, not the state. But this critical theory mood is clouding this whole issue, and kids are being told that if someone doesn't agree with you, if someone doesn't agree with your vision of who you want to be, then they're actually your enemy. They're actually wrong. They're actually harmful. They're actually dangerous to you. And this is the final expression of what I think is the most important thing to understand about the cultural waters. And it's not an easy thing to really grasp. And it may sound even depressing and hopeless. It's not. And we're going to come back to what we can then do to navigate these waters helpfully. But the most important development in our world over the last several generations has been really our devolution into what some sociologists have called a cultural identity crisis. If you think that the most important developments of our culture when it comes to sex and sexuality that you got to prepare your kids for are the moral ones, then you're missing it. If you think that the headline of the last several decades is that things that used to be considered wrong are now considered right, and things that used to be considered right are now considered wrong. I mean, that's observably true. I'm not saying that's not true. Of course it's true. Things that used to be taboo aren't. Things that used to be considered normal were not. To say that they're normal or that now makes you a bad person. I mean, that all is observably true. But the moral shifts that have taken place in our culture are not the root. They're the fruit. At the root of all the moral confusion that we have is a confusion about identity, about who we are as humans, about whether we are just occupying bodies or whether our bodies are an essential part of who we are, whether we are designed or whether we're autonomous, whether there's something about us that's given to us in the way that we're made, or whether we have the right and even, as some would say, the responsibility to impose our emotions, impose our feelings, impose our inner beliefs on the world. That's the great area of conflict. It's whether there's anything created by a loving, caring creator, by a God who knows me, who created me in his image, and knows what is true, or whether I'm self-created and I can do whatever I want. And understanding that the crisis is at the root of identity and not just as behavior has got to inform how we think and teach our kids when it comes to sex. Because if we just tell them, here's how you ought to behave, and here's how you ought not to behave, in a culture that's essentially stealing their souls, in a culture that's essentially stealing any sense of who they are, then we're basically just going to be putting a decoration on a fundamentally wrong way of thinking about who they are and who they are in relationship to others. So it's essential that we understand these cultural waters, because that will then help us prepare kids to navigate. And we can point out the lies. We can point out the confusion whenever they come across it. We don't want, in this culture where things that should not be considered normal are considered normal, we don't want our kids thinking that they are normal, because that's how culture shapes our hearts and minds. Culture's far more effective in what it assumes than what it announces.